Welcome to the past unveiled, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe, not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Now beginning. Story 1. The Treaty That Carved the World, Tordesillas and Its Ripples. You are in the court of Europe in the late 15th century. The air smells of incense and candle wax. Thick stone walls echo with clerical footsteps and the murmurs of advisors speaking in Latin and Castilian. It is here, in the hush after conquest and discovery, that one of the most quietly consequential decisions in global history is about to be made, not with armies but with ink and papal authority. The Treaty of Tordesillas is rarely remembered in full. You may know it as a moment when the world was, quite literally, divided in two by a pen stroke. But the details are stranger and more mundane than you might imagine, filled with uncertainty, poorly drawn maps, and a great deal of diplomatic boredom. The Papal Bulls, origins of the divide. The treaty itself was not the beginning. Before it came the Papal Bulls of 1493. Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia and famously controversial, issued a series of documents known as Intercetera. They granted Spain exclusive rights to claim newly discovered lands west of a certain meridian in the Atlantic. Portugal, whose sailors had already long scouted the coast of Africa and tasted imperial ambition, found itself discontent with this arrangement. Why should Spain receive the lion's share of the New World simply because Christopher Columbus, an Italian sailing under a Spanish flag, had stumbled onto Caribbean islands just the year before? Portugal, under King João II, had leverage. The country already had a seafaring empire in development, and so began the negotiations that would lead to the Treaty of Tordesillas. A line with no map. The essence of the treaty was simple. The world would be split along a north-south line, approximately 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. Spain would claim lands west of this line, Portugal to the east. But the implementation was anything but simple. You must remember, in 1494, longitude could not be measured accurately at sea. Mariners relied on dead reckoning and rudimentary instruments. The notion of dividing the globe at an imaginary line whose exact location no one could verify, let alone enforce, was almost laughable. Yet it happened. The treaty was signed on June 7, 1494, in the small Spanish town of Tordesillas. It was the product of political fatigue as much as ambition. The Castilian and Portuguese monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella on one side, João II on the other, agreed to avoid war over unknown lands. It was a gamble of unprecedented scale. Imagine the absurdity: dividing the entire undiscovered world between two Christian monarchies on a hunch, without knowing whether it contained continents, empires, or simply more ocean. The world beyond Europe in the minds of the treaty's authors was a vague and limitless canvas. And so they drew a line. The men behind the quills. Little attention is often paid to the scribes and negotiators who actually made the treaty happen. Juan de Coloma, a secretary to Ferdinand and Isabella, and Rui de Sousa, an envoy for João II, exchanged dry, measured statements. Their job was not glory, but to ensure that future voyages wouldn't lead to skirmishes between Iberian fleets. Most of the negotiations involved minute wording, legal definitions, and disagreements over leagues and nautical distances. They argued about how to phrase the rights of possession. They worried over which lands had already been discovered and which had not. They tried to imagine scenarios involving lands yet unseen, and what to do when ships inevitably ran aground on shores unknown. The treaty's global consequences. In a strange twist, the line eventually granted Portugal rights to what would become Brazil, though no one knew it at the time. When Pedro Álvares Cabral's fleet arrived on the Brazilian coast in 1500, it conveniently lay east of the Tordesillas line. Some historians argue this was not a coincidence, but rather a veiled understanding by the Portuguese of South America's eastern bulge. Further east, the line extended halfway around the world. Portugal would later argue that this also gave them claim to the Spice Islands' modern Indonesia. This interpretation, disputed by Spain, would lead to decades of friction and a separate treaty, the Treaty of Zaragoza in 1529. In short, the Tordesillas line was the first formal declaration that the non-European world was up for partitioning. It wasn't the final word, but it was the starting point for a pattern of colonial ambition that would repeat itself across centuries and continents. And yet so many questions. How could a treaty made in a Spanish town, signed by European kings, affect people living thousands of miles away who had never heard of Europe? What would indigenous peoples across Africa, Asia, and the Americas make of this line if they'd known of it? And perhaps most pressing of all, how did this abstract, legally cumbersome agreement actually influence the next wave of expeditions, conflicts, and conquests? You awaken to the quiet lapping of water against wooden hulls. It is the year 1495. The Treaty of Tordesillas has been signed, sealed, and mostly forgotten by the public if they ever knew of it at all. But for a handful of navigators, court officials, and ambitious monarchs, that invisible line across the Atlantic has become very real. And while no physical marker exists in the sea, it begins to influence the course of ships, the reach of flags, and the fates of people in lands still barely known to Europe. It is in this unmarked reality that the treaty's consequences begin to unfold slowly, quietly, and irrevocably. The curious case of Cabral and Brazil. On March 9, 1500, a fleet of 13 Portuguese ships set sail from Lisbon, commanded by Pedro Álvares Cabral. Their destination was the Indian Ocean, following Vasco da Gama's route around the Cape of Good Hope to establish trade ties with India. Yet after rounding the Canary Islands, Cabral steered his ships unusually far westward. You might wonder why. Was it a navigational error, a detour to avoid the doldrums, or, as some scholars speculate, a calculated move based on secret Portuguese charts that hinted at a landmass to the west conveniently placed just east of the Tordesillas line? On April 22, 1500, Cabral made landfall on the coast of what is now Brazil, at a place he called Porto Seguro. His crew encountered indigenous Tupiniquim peoples and raised a wooden cross on the beach, claiming the land for King Manuel I of Portugal. To the casual observer, it seemed like a lucky discovery, but to the political elite, it was the quiet validation of a diplomatic victory. The Treaty of Tordesillas had given Portugal rights to that exact slice of South America without a cannon fired, without a single protest from Spain. This moment marked the true geographical and imperial impact of the treaty. The paper line drawn years earlier had now turned into territorial possession, trade potential, and eventual colonization. Spanish expansion and the frustration of the line. Meanwhile, Spain was expanding westward with growing urgency. Columbus's voyages had opened the Caribbean, and by 1504, his successors were exploring farther into the Americas. Yet the Tordesillas line constantly loomed as a potential limit. Spanish explorers would sometimes sail eastward from Caribbean ports and ask themselves consciously or not, are we still within our half of the world? The ambiguity led to tensions. Maps were often vague, distances were miscalculated, and mariners could not agree where the meridian truly fell. Spanish ships ventured toward Central America, while Portuguese fleets circled Africa, both sides quietly pushing their boundaries, testing the other's resolve. It was not always clear whether a land was on the Spanish or Portuguese side, and even when it was, the lack of enforcement mechanisms made it easy to ignore. Still, the treaty served as a framework for negotiation and justification. When disputes arose, kings could point to it and say, "Here is the law, here is the line." But what happened when the line wrapped around the globe? Circling the globe toward a second treaty. By the 1510s, the global implications of Tordesillas began to complicate matters. You see, the earth is a sphere. If the line granted Spain the west and Portugal the east, then somewhere in the Pacific, the two empires would meet again on the far side of the world. But where exactly? No one knew. Spain, emboldened by new discoveries, eyed the Spice Islands, the Maluku archipelago in modern-day Indonesia, as part of its domain. Portugal, however, claimed they lay east of the original meridian, and thus belonged to them. This disagreement would not be resolved by Tordesillas alone. It would take a second treaty, the Treaty of Zaragoza, in 1529 to attempt closure, but even that would fail to end the argument. In this liminal space between hemispheres, Spain and Portugal raced not only to colonize, but to justify their claims with charts, clocks, and celestial measurements. Early cosmographers tried to pinpoint antipodal lines, yet without accurate longitudinal data, it was like trying to measure fog with a ruler. Everyday impact: ships, sailors, and settlers. Beyond the courts and treaties, the implications of Tordesillas trickled down to sailors and settlers. Portuguese captains were instructed to avoid Spanish-controlled waters, leading to more roundabout routes. Portuguese settlements in Africa, India, and Brazil developed with a distinct identity: commercial, fortified, and often temporary. Spain, on the other hand, pursued deeper inland colonization in the Americas, building cities and religious missions. The division of empire began to shape not just where Europeans went, but how they engaged with local peoples. Portuguese interactions in Asia often involved trade and diplomacy. Spanish conquests in the Americas led to widespread displacement and restructuring of native societies. Even maps, such as the Cantino Planisphere, 1502, became geopolitical tools. The map secretly smuggled from Lisbon to Italy visually depicted the Portuguese claims under Tordesillas. It served not just as a navigational aid, but as political propaganda. Cartography was no longer just about where things were. It was about who owned them. The invisible becomes real. For most of the world, the Treaty of Tordesillas remained invisible. Indigenous peoples did not recognize its authority, nor did the myriad of Asian, African, or Pacific societies that would later encounter Europeans. Yet its effects were real. The treaty created a geopolitical rhythm, a division of labor, if you will, between Portugal and Spain. It limited wars between the two powers, at least for a time. It gave monarchs a legal claim to justify their expansion, and it encouraged other European nations, like England, France, and the Dutch, to challenge Iberian supremacy later in the 16th century. In a sense, Tordesillas was a ghost treaty. It haunted every voyage, every map, every territorial dispute. It cast a shadow over exploration, one that grew longer as ships sailed farther. And yet still unresolved. How did Portugal maintain control of its eastern claims when so many others challenged it in Asia? Why did the other European powers, England, France, the Netherlands, largely ignore the Treaty of Tordesillas? And what role did this treaty play in shaping early global capitalism? Close your eyes and listen to the rustling of maps in candle-lit rooms, the creaking of old ship decks, and the subtle power shifts whispered across royal courts. The Treaty of Tordesillas, born in 1494, is still echoing into the next century. Though its clauses are fixed in ink, its meaning continues to shift with every league sailed and every coast claimed. This final section traces the legacy and eventual unraveling of the treaty not as a moment in history, but as a framework that helped define early modern imperialism. What began as a bilateral agreement evolved into a philosophical precedent that the world could be divided, owned, and measured by those with the power to draw lines on maps. A treaty in practice, enforcement and evasion. You might imagine the treaty was tightly enforced, with violators punished and lines carefully monitored. That, however, would be a fantasy. In reality, the Treaty of Tordesillas was only as strong as its interpreters. It depended on compliance and mutual respect, not on enforcement through international law. The line had no guards, no boundary stones, and no maritime checkpoints. When Portuguese ships turned up in contested waters, Spain issued complaints. When Spanish conquistadors crossed the wrong meridian, Portugal sent diplomats. Occasionally, ships were seized or skirmishes erupted, but more often than not, the treaty was a diplomatic guideline rather than a hard rule. In Asia, the Spanish claimed the Philippines, even though they arguably lay within Portuguese territory under the treaty. Portugal protested, but the Spanish crown insisted they had acquired the islands by other means, chiefly through the actions of Ferdinand Magellan, who had sailed west to reach them, not east. This loophole, the direction of arrival, became a favored tool in territorial disputes. The Treaty of Zaragoza, 1529, a line goes full circle. To resolve the conflicts in Asia, Spain and Portugal convened again, this time to discuss the anti-meridian of Tordesillas. If you circumnavigate the Earth, eventually the division line must reappear. But where? The Treaty of Zaragoza in 1529 attempted to solve this by drawing a new line east of the Moluccas, the famed Spice Islands. Portugal would pay Spain a substantial some 350,000 ducats to renounce claims to the islands. In exchange, Spain would keep the Philippines, a somewhat ambiguous deal, and look elsewhere for influence. This new treaty was more explicit, but like its predecessor, it could not account for future changes. Navigation was improving. Other European nations were watching. The monopoly of Iberia would not last. The cracks begin to show. By the mid-16th century, France and England had begun to challenge the very basis of the Iberian division of the world. French King Francis I famously mocked the treaty by asking to see the clause in Adam's will that granted Spain and Portugal exclusive rights over the world. French privateers raided Portuguese trading posts in Brazil and the Caribbean. English ships ventured into the Atlantic, eager to find their own routes and riches. The Dutch would later enter the scene as a commercial force, eventually prying colonies away from both Iberian powers. By the early 1600s, the world was no longer neatly divided in two. It was becoming crowded with ambition, and the original Tordesillas line, already invisible, was now irrelevant in practice. The treaty's colonial legacy. Even as the treaty faded in importance, its legacy endured in the shape of colonial empires. The Portuguese retained control over Brazil, Angola, Mozambique, Goa, Malacca, and parts of East Timor, scattered yet connected by trade routes. Spain, on the other hand, held vast continental lands in the Americas, from Mexico to Peru and across to the Philippines. The division shaped linguistic, cultural, and religious boundaries that persist today. Brazil speaks Portuguese while its neighbors speak Spanish. Catholic missions followed colonial lines, shaping education, architecture, and cultural identity. In fact, much of Latin America's present-day geopolitics still reflects these early colonial choices. The line, while long erased from charts, is still etched into the cultural geography of the modern world. The line revisited by later powers. Even centuries later, scholars, missionaries, and colonial officials reference the Treaty of Tordesillas to justify actions or draw comparisons. During later colonial scrambles by the Dutch, British, and French, Some historians and diplomats looked back at the Iberian precedent as either a warning or a model. The Tordesillas mindset, the idea that powers could unilaterally divide the globe among themselves, echoed in the Berlin Conference of 1884, when European powers partitioned Africa in similarly bureaucratic fashion. Though the context had changed, the principle had not. Empires justified expansion through paperwork as much as power. A treaty without a voice. One of the most quietly tragic elements of the Treaty of Tordesillas was the complete absence of voices from the lands being divided. No ambassador from the Americas, no ruler from an African kingdom, no merchant from the Malabar coast, and no chief from the Philippines had any say. The entire non-European world was treated as blank space, awaiting discovery, conquest, or commerce. And yet these spaces were not empty. They were filled with people, traditions, governance, languages, and economies. The treaty, in its Eurocentric arrogance, reduced these realities to mere points of possession. It ignored sovereignty and assumed divine right, a notion reinforced by papal bulls and cloaked in religious language. The treaty's strange immortality. Today, the Treaty of Tordesillas may seem a relic, archaic, and irrelevant, but its core concept continues to appear in subtle ways. Consider modern maritime boundaries, satellite orbits, internet governance, and even claims over the moon and Mars. In each case, powerful nations debate where one's rights begin and another's end, often without involving those most affected. The Treaty of Tordesillas teaches a quiet lesson about ambition, compromise, and the limits of human control over geography. It also reminds us of the absurdity of trying to draw fixed lines in a world that is constantly shifting geologically, politically, and morally. Final reflection: how should we remember the line? Was the Treaty of Tordesillas a brilliant diplomatic solution or a blueprint for injustice? Did it preserve peace or postpone inevitable conflict? And perhaps most hauntingly, if a line is drawn in the middle of the ocean, and no one sees it but it changes the lives of millions, what does that say about the nature of power? Story 2. Under Portuguese sails, the rise of Vasco da Gama. You find yourself on the sun-bleached coast of Sines, Portugal. The wind carries the scent of salt and fish. Behind you are stone houses with red clay roofs. Ahead, the endless sea. Here begins the story of Vasco da Gama, not with fanfare or declarations, but with silence, salt air, and the long patience of a sailor's life. Da Gama's voyage to India would become one of the most defining moments of the Age of Discovery, opening a sea route that would shift global trade, religious conflicts, and imperial ambitions. But before he was a legend, he was just a man shaped by the ambitions of his kingdom, the technology of his time, and the geography of his birth. Portugal at the edge of the world. In the mid-15th century, Portugal was a small kingdom on Europe's western fringe. Surrounded by ocean on two sides and overshadowed by larger kingdoms like Castile and France, Portugal had little room to expand by land, so it turned its attention to the sea. Under the leadership of Prince Henry the Navigator, though he himself never sailed far, Portugal had already begun exploring the Atlantic and the West African coast. By the 1460s, Portuguese sailors had reached Sierra Leone, and trading posts had been established along the African coast. The motivation was clear: spices, gold, and converts. The Ottoman Empire controlled overland trade routes to Asia, and European kingdoms wanted a direct maritime path to bypass Muslim middlemen and enrich themselves directly. It was into this climate of maritime ambition that Vasco da Gama was born. The da Gama family, not nobility, not commoners. Vasco da Gama was born around 1460, likely in the coastal town of Sines. His father, Estevão da Gama, was a minor noble who served as a knight in the Order of Santiago and later as commander of the fortress at Sines. The family was not part of the highest nobility, but they had connections. They lived in the shadowy tier between elite and ordinary, just enough influence to be noticed by the royal court, but not so powerful as to dictate terms. This made them ideal candidates for risky assignments and maritime ventures. Little is known about Vasco's early life. He likely studied mathematics, astronomy, and navigation subjects essential to sailing. He may have trained with seasoned pilots or studied at one of the nautical schools in Lisbon. What is clear is that he was shaped by a generation of exploration. He would have heard tales of Bartolomeu Dias rounding the Cape of Good Hope in 1488. He would have known of the riches in the Indian Ocean, whispered through merchants and chronicled in royal documents. And he would have known that Portugal's future lay not on land, but across the waves. Choosing da Gama. By the mid-1490s, King Manuel I of Portugal, also known as Manuel the Fortunate, was eager to outpace Spain. Columbus had sailed west and stumbled upon the Caribbean under a Spanish flag. Portugal needed a success of its own. Manuel was determined to establish a sea route to India around Africa. The voyage would be long, dangerous, and logistically complex. The ships had to round the Cape of Good Hope, pass into uncharted waters, and enter Indian territory with unknown political risks. Initially, the mission was intended for Vasco's father, Estevão da Gama, but he died before it could begin. The king then appointed Vasco. Why him? Perhaps because he was competent and connected. Perhaps because he had no high noble house to threaten the king's authority. Or perhaps because, in a country obsessed with the sea, he simply stood out as capable and reliable. In 1497, at about 37 years of age, Vasco da Gama took command of one of the most ambitious expeditions of the early modern world. Preparing for the voyage. The preparations for da Gama's voyage were a logistical feat. 4 ships were built or refitted. The São Gabriel, commanded by Vasco da Gama. The São Rafael, commanded by his brother Paulo da Gama. A caravel named the Berrio, under Nicolau Silho. And a large storage ship for supplies. Each ship carried provisions for 2 years, barrels of water and wine, salted meat, hardtack, and dried beans. Spare rigging, anchors, and weapons filled the lower decks. They carried gold and silver coins to trade with foreign merchants, along with religious objects for diplomacy and perhaps conversion. The crew included sailors, carpenters, caulkers, interpreters, and even a convict pilot, pardoned in exchange for service. They also carried a padrão, an inscribed stone pillar to plant in new lands as a symbol of Portuguese sovereignty. These stone markers would become recurring symbols of imperial possession. On July 8, 1497, the fleet departed Lisbon, slipping down the Tagus River and into the Atlantic. No one on board knew what lay ahead. No one could promise they would return. The voyage begins. Da Gama followed the southern route pioneered by earlier explorers. He first sailed south along the African coast, stopping at the Canary and Cape Verde Islands, then veering far west into the Atlantic to catch favorable winds. This Volta do Mar, the return of the sea, was a Portuguese innovation in navigation, using oceanic wind patterns to one's advantage. Though it meant sailing away from land for weeks, it shortened travel time and avoided dangerous coastal currents. They rounded the Cape of Good Hope by late November 1497 and entered the Indian Ocean by the start of 1498. By this time, da Gama had traveled farther than any European before him. But he had also lost men to scurvy and illness. Morale was brittle, supplies were stretched, and beyond the Cape lay new political world sultanates, trading cities and networks unlike anything in Europe. Was India waiting for them, or resistance? A new world beckons. As da Gama approached the East African coast, stopping at places like Mozambique and Mombasa, he encountered the edges of Islamic trade networks. Arab and Swahili merchants controlled the ports. The Portuguese had to negotiate carefully, often pretending to be Christian Muslims to gain favor. Da Gama soon realized that brute force would not suffice. Diplomacy, deception, and cautious observation would become as important as navigation. Finally, in May 1498, da Gama reached the Indian port of Calicut, modern-day Kozhikode, on the southwestern coast. It was the culmination of a dream that had shaped Portugal for a century. Yet da Gama quickly learned that reaching India was not the same as succeeding there. And yet all was not well. The reception in Calicut was less than enthusiastic. Da Gama brought few valuable gifts. The local Zamorin ruler was unimpressed. Negotiations were strained, and the Portuguese struggled to make inroads into the well-established spice trade. Da Gama had made it to India, but could he turn presence into profit? Could he turn a rival into empire? And more urgently, how would this first contact set the tone for centuries of conflict, cooperation, and colonization in the Indian Ocean? You are in the port city of Calicut. The smell is unlike anything you've known in Europe. Cinnamon, cardamom, black pepper, and ginger all swirl through the humid air. The harbor is a symphony of languages and sails: Arab dhows, Chinese junks, Indian fishing boats. It is a place where wealth is measured not in gold but in cloves. Vasco da Gama had arrived at the end of his long voyage, but instead of triumph, he faced confusion, mistrust, and a clash of civilizations. Though he had found India, the journey had just begun. For all his navigational prowess, da Gama was woefully unprepared for the political and commercial complexities of the Indian Ocean world. This section follows da Gama's first encounters with the East, where diplomacy faltered, suspicion reigned, and the true costs of empire began to show. Calicut, city of spices, seat of suspicion. Calicut, ruled by the Hindu Zamorin, was one of the most prominent trading cities in South India. Its wealth and prestige came not from conquest, but from its role as a tolerant, open market. Muslim merchants from Arabia, Persia, and East Africa had long operated there. Trade, not war, was the order of the day. When Vasco da Gama arrived in May 1498, he expected to be received as a herald of a superior Christian kingdom. He carried letters from King Manuel of Portugal, gifts of cloth and trinkets, and a small but disciplined fleet. But these gestures fell short. The Zamorin's court was sophisticated, and its standards for foreign dignitaries were high. Da Gama's gifts, coarse textiles, hats, sugar, were seen as laughably poor. In return, the Zamorin offered mild courtesy but little in the way of concrete agreements. There was also the problem of religion. Portuguese reports often referred to the Zamorin as a Christian ruler, likely due to miscommunication or wishful thinking. But Calicut was not a Christian state. It was deeply pluralistic, dominated by Hindu elites and Muslim merchant guilds. Da Gama's insistence on spreading Christianity was met with confusion and quiet resistance. The politics of trade. In da Gama's mind, opening trade was a matter of planting flags and receiving concessions. But the Indian Ocean operated on an entirely different system. Merchants, not monarchs, controlled commerce. Contracts were built on reputation and reliability, not declarations of kings. Da Gama, representing a distant and unknown power, was viewed as a curiosity rather than a partner. Portuguese chroniclers speak of insults, tensions, and humiliation. Muslim traders, long established in Calicut, distrusted the Christian newcomers. Some actively worked to sabotage the Portuguese mission by spreading rumors and influencing the Zamorin's court. Da Gama, unfamiliar with the intricacies of Indian diplomacy, responded with suspicion. He believed he was being conspired against. In a telling moment, when asked to pay a standard customs duty, he took offense and accused the court of trying to rob him. This cultural misalignment led to a breakdown in negotiations. The Zamorin, unimpressed and uninterested in causing unrest, allowed da Gama to leave but gave him no formal trade rights or lasting agreement. Tensions turned hostile. Before departing, da Gama demanded a letter of reply from the Zamorin to King Manuel. The Zamorin agreed, but delayed either due to court bureaucracy or quiet protest. Frustrated, da Gama took matters into his own hands. He captured several local hostages, threatening violence unless the letter was produced. The tactic worked. He received the letter, but it poisoned any potential goodwill. This was a pattern that would repeat across the Portuguese Empire. When diplomacy faltered, force followed. And in the Indian Ocean, this reliance on coercion would become a defining trait of Portuguese rule. The return journey, survival in sorrow. Da Gama departed Calicut in late August 1498 with a small cargo of spices. Though the mission had not produced a trade alliance, it had proven the sea route to India possible and profitable. But the return voyage was brutal. Crossing the Arabian Sea to Africa took over 3 months, during which scurvy ravaged the crew. The disease, caused by vitamin C deficiency, was little understood at the time. Gums bled, limbs swelled, and dozens died. At Malindi, in modern-day Kenya, da Gama stopped to take on supplies and consult local pilots. There, he encountered experienced navigators who helped guide him around the Cape of Good Hope, a reminder that Portuguese navigation still relied heavily on indigenous expertise. By the time he returned to Lisbon in July 1499, da Gama had lost more than half his men. One of the dead was his own brother, Paulo da Gama, who had to be left behind at the Azores, too ill to complete the journey. Vasco reportedly stayed with him until the end before returning to the Portuguese court. Lisbon rejoices and prepares for war. Despite the hardships, da Gama was celebrated as a hero. Lisbon rejoiced. Church bells rang. The court declared his mission a divine success. He had opened the gateway to the east. King Manuel I quickly moved to capitalize on the voyage. He commissioned another fleet, this time larger and better armed, to return to India not just to trade, but to enforce Portuguese will. That next fleet, under Pedro Álvares Cabral, would encounter resistance in Calicut and respond by bombarding the city with cannon fire. From that moment forward, the Portuguese approach to empire would shift from exploration to domination. Vasco da Gama had not intended to launch a war, but his journey, brave, flawed, and tragic, set the foundation for an imperial model built on fortresses, gunpowder, and maritime control. The cost of glory. Da Gama's first voyage was not merely a tale of bravery. It was also a story of misunderstanding, loss, and unintended consequences. He had navigated unknown waters but misread political winds. He had opened a sea route but closed the door to peaceful engagement. And yet, his voyage would become the cornerstone of the Portuguese Empire in Asia. Portugal would soon control key ports across the Indian Ocean, from Goa to Malacca. Missionaries, merchants, and mercenaries would follow. The spice trade would flow west, enriching Europe and transforming diets, economies, and even power structures. But behind every sack of pepper lay the memory of dead sailors, failed negotiations, and fragile ships tossed by wind and wave. And still the story is incomplete. What became of da Gama after his triumphant return? Did he live a life of peace, or was he drawn back to the sea? And how did his second voyage shape the fate of Portuguese India? The drums of empire beat louder now. It's the early 1500s, and Lisbon is no longer just the capital of a small Atlantic kingdom. It has become the nerve center of a growing seaborne empire. From its bustling harbors, fleets launch not just for trade but to impose order on foreign shores. In this final chapter, we follow Vasco da Gama's return to India, not as an explorer but as an admiral armed with royal authority and cannon. His second and third voyages are not tales of discovery, but of violence, retaliation, and the complex machinery of empire building. Da Gama's transition from navigator to imperial enforcer reveals not only the personal cost of his ambition, but the changing face of European engagement with the wider world. Return with a Vengeance. The Second Voyage, 1502-1503. 4 years after his first voyage, da Gama was called upon again. The circumstances were dramatically different. Pedro Alvarez Cabral's fleet, which had followed da Gama's path in 1500, had met fierce resistance in Calicut. After failed diplomacy, the Portuguese bombarded the city and fled. Portugal now knew that trade in India would not be handed over willingly. In 1502, da Gama returned to India with a fleet of 20 heavily armed ships, a mixture of carracks and caravels. He was no longer a hopeful explorer. He was the appointed admiral of the Indian Ocean, authorized to use force to secure Portuguese interests. His mission was clear: retaliate, dominate, and extract. The execution at sea. One of the darkest moments in da Gama's legacy occurred on this second voyage. Near the coast of modern-day India, his fleet captured a large Arab merchant ship, the Miram, carrying over 400 Muslim passengers, including women and children pilgrims returning from Mecca. Despite appeals for mercy and large ransoms offered, da Gama ordered the ship looted, its passengers locked below deck, and the vessel set ablaze. Contemporary accounts are chilling in their detail. Screams echoed across the sea as the ship sank slowly into the water. The incident was meant to send a message to Calicut and to the Muslim traders who controlled much of the Indian Ocean trade network. Da Gama's goal was not simply to punish. It was psychological warfare designed to break resistance through fear. Calicut under siege. When he reached Calicut, da Gama demanded that the Zamorin expel all Muslim merchants and accept Portuguese monopolies. The Zamorin refused. In response, da Gama blockaded the port and began bombarding the city with cannon from his ships. Coastal buildings burned and trade ground to a halt. He also captured several Indian hostages, including high-ranking officials, and mutilated them before sending them back with a warning: submit or suffer. This was not exploration, it was punitive imperialism. The Portuguese, having failed to integrate into the Indian Ocean trade peacefully, now sought to reshape it by force. Establishing the Portuguese strategy. Da Gama's brutal tactics became the foundation for Portuguese imperial strategy in Asia. Fortified trading posts. Rather than conquering vast territories, Portugal would build fortresses at key ports: Goa, Malacca, Hormuz controlling choke points. Cardazes, sea passes. Ships were forced to purchase licenses from the Portuguese or be attacked. This maritime toll system extended Portuguese influence across thousands of miles. Naval supremacy. With superior artillery and large ships, Portugal could dominate coastal waters even with small numbers. But these methods earned Portugal as many enemies as allies. Indigenous rulers and Muslim merchants viewed the Portuguese not as partners, but as pirates backed by a crown. Return to Portugal and political frustration. Da Gama returned to Lisbon in 1503. He was celebrated again, rewarded with titles, wealth, and ceremonial praise. Yet his second voyage also raised questions. Had he ensured stable trade routes or provoked endless resistance? Was he a patriot or a butcher? At court, da Gama faced political frustrations. He was not appointed Viceroy of India, an honor given to more favored nobles like Francisco de Almeida and later Afonso de Albuquerque. Da Gama, despite his achievements, lacked the courtly polish and political allies needed to remain central to royal strategy. For nearly 2 decades, he lived mostly in retirement, managing his estates and titles. He had been granted the noble title Count of Vidigueira, making him the first Portuguese commoner to be so elevated. but history had one more turn in store. Final voyage. The old man sent back 1524. In 1524, at the age of roughly 64, Vasco da Gama was called out of retirement. The empire in India had become unstable. Corruption, infighting, and administrative breakdowns threatened Portuguese control. King João III appointed da Gama as the new viceroy of Portuguese India, hoping that the aging admiral's stern leadership would restore order. Da Gama sailed once more to India, this time not as a warrior, but as an imperial administrator. He landed in Goa and began to reform the colonial bureaucracy, removing corrupt officials and standardizing tax collection. His authority was respected. His experience commanded obedience. But his time was short. Within months of his arrival, Vasco da Gama fell ill, likely due to a combination of age, exhaustion, and tropical disease. He died in Cochin on Christmas Eve, 1524. His body was buried in India, though it would later be moved back to Portugal. The afterlife of a legacy. Vasco da Gama's life is remembered with both reverence and discomfort. In Portugal, he is lionized a national hero, the one who opened the sea route to India. His voyages are celebrated in Luís de Camões' epic poem Os Lusíadas, where he is portrayed as a near-mythical figure. But in South Asia and the Indian Ocean world, his legacy is marked by violence. His arrival coincided with a century of bloodshed, cultural disruption, and economic upheaval. He stands as a symbol of both the limits of exploration and the reach of empire. He proved that the sea could be crossed, but in doing so, he redrew the maps of power, trade, and suffering. Final reflection: the price of passage. Da Gama's life leaves us with questions as vast as the oceans he sailed. What does it mean to be a discoverer when others already live in the places you find? Can imperial glory ever be separated from violence? And perhaps most hauntingly, was the sea route to India a triumph of navigation, or the beginning of something far darker? Story 3. Spice and Scurvy Life aboard a 16th century caravel. You are now aboard a Portuguese caravel, rocking gently in the Atlantic swell. The sky is wide and unbroken. The sails above you groan with wind, and the air carries a sharp mix of salt, pitch, and something more earthy: sweat, rotting wood, and the musk of men who have not bathed in weeks. This is not the world of great explorers or royal courts. This is the other side of the age of discovery, the story of life at sea, where the ambition of kings is measured out in wormy biscuits, salty meat, and aching bones. Here, history was made not by admirals and monarchs, but by the silent, suffering majority, the crew. Before Portugal and Spain carved empires, they had to endure the sea. In this story, we shift the lens away from da Gama and Columbus and toward the ordinary sailor, the mariner who lived, worked, and often died aboard the floating cities of empire. The caravel, workhorse of the seas. The caravella, or caravel, was the defining ship of early Iberian exploration. It was light, fast, and agile, ideal for coasting along shores and venturing into unknown currents. Caravels typically ranged from 50 to 80 feet in length and could carry between 20 and 30 men. They were equipped with 2 to 4 masts and lateen, triangular sails, which allowed them to sail against the wind, a crucial advantage for exploration. Their hulls were clinker-built, overlapping planks, strengthened with tar and animal hair and prone to leaking. Below deck, space was tight. There was no true below deck, as you'd imagine today, just a dark, damp storage area filled with provisions, barrels, and cargo. Life happened above deck day and night. Who were the sailors? The average sailor in the Portuguese Navy was not a professional. He was a peasant, a fisherman, a convict, or even a pressed man taken into service against his will. Many were illiterate. Few had ever been far from land. They came for different reasons: hunger, debt, conscription, or the promise, however slim, of riches or forgiveness. Some were pardoned criminals, given the choice between gallows and the sea. The result was a motley crew, hardened, rough, superstitious, and deeply fatalistic. They wore simple wool or linen tunics, rough trousers, and sometimes belts with pouches of dried herbs or garlic, believed to ward off evil or sickness. Footwear was rare. Most went barefoot for better grip on wet decks. Daily life on board. Time at sea was measured not in days but in watches, shifts of 4 hours, around the clock. The bells of the ship marked the change of watch. Sleep was stolen in brief, broken intervals. Hammocks were still rare. Sailors often slept on the open deck or in corners among the cargo. Their diet was meager. Hardtack ship's biscuit, rock hard, infested with weevils. Salted cod or pork, rancid after weeks. Dried beans and peas, often moldy. Water, spoiled quickly and turned green with algae. Wine, mixed with vinegar, it was more reliable than water. Occasionally they caught fish, but mostly they chewed, endured, and prayed. Cooking was done in a brick firebox called a fogow, chained to the deck to keep it from tipping. Fires were dangerous at sea, and meals were crude boiled gruel or salted meat stew. Scurvy, the hidden killer. One of the greatest threats to sailors was not storm or combat but scurvy. Caused by a lack of vitamin C, scurvy destroyed the body from within. Early symptoms included fatigue and swollen gums, but within weeks it grew horrific. Teeth fell out, old wounds reopened, and muscles rotted beneath the skin. Some went mad before death. The smell of a scurvy-ridden ship was unforgettable. There was no cure at the time. The connection to fresh fruit would not be firmly understood until centuries later. Da Gama's first voyage to India lost 2/3 of its crew, largely to scurvy. The disease could wipe out a fleet without warning, quietly, slowly, invisibly. Storms and superstition. The ocean was a terrifying place. Storms could strike without warning, and early caravels were fragile before nature's fury. Masts snapped, hulls flooded, men were thrown overboard and lost. Sailors were deeply superstitious. Many believed in sea monsters, ghost ships, and cursed waters. The equator was feared as a barrier into an unknown world. Rites of passage included mock trials, floggings, and strange initiations for sailors crossing it for the first time. Prayers to Our Lady of the Good Voyage were common. Some carried tiny relics of saints, hung from belts or around necks. Lightning, red skis, or large birds were seen as omens. Silence often reigned before storms, as crews whispered prayers and made private offerings. Hierarchies and harsh discipline. Ship life was harshly regimented. At the top stood the captain, often a noble or royal appointee, more comfortable with politics than sailing. Next came the pilot, the true brains of navigation. Then the boatswain, the carpenter, and the sailmaster, each crucial for daily survival. The ordinary sailors were at the bottom. Discipline was brutal. Flogging for disobedience. Keel hauling or dunking for theft. Death for mutiny or insubordination. Yet despite this, ships could not function without cooperation. In the face of shared danger, a strange camaraderie grew. Jokes, songs, and games passed the hours. Sailors carved graffiti into planks. They told stories of home or of impossible lands beyond the horizon. And yet they kept sailing. Despite the misery, despite the deaths, they kept going, ship after ship, voyage after voyage. Why? Some did it for survival, others for redemption, many for gold or spices, and some just a few for the unknowable thrill of being the first, the one who returned with tales that no one else could tell. These men were the backbone of empire, the anonymous hands that raised sails, scrubbed decks, and turned the wheels of history without ever being remembered by name. They did not discover new worlds, they endured them. And still there's more to know. What happened when these floating cities made landfall? How did the men interact with the cultures they encountered? What did they carry back home besides spices and scars? Land on the horizon. After weeks or even months at sea, this cry would send a jolt of emotion through the exhausted sailors aboard a Portuguese caravel. Excitement, relief, fear, and uncertainty. For most crewmen, landfall wasn't just a destination, it was survival. A chance for food, water, rest, and perhaps a reprieve from the constant motion of the sea. But coming ashore brought its own challenges. On the distant coasts of Africa, Asia, or the Americas, the men who had endured waves, wind, and hunger were now face to face with unfamiliar people, languages, flora, and climates. The stories of contact between Europeans and the societies they encountered often focus on the famous conquistadors, kings, treaties. But what of the sailors? What of their first steps on new shores, their interactions and fears and astonishment? This section explores what happened when these floating microcosms met the wider world, and how ordinary seamen navigated the strange terrain of first contact. The landing, tense taboos and trade. Landfall began with caution. Portuguese captains would often send scouts or small landing parties before anchoring their vessels fully. These men were not diplomats. They were armed, suspicious, and often uninformed about who or what they would find. If the coast was inhabited, they might encounter fishing villages with locals who were curious or wary, traders or emissaries who had already seen other ships, hostility signaled with arrows, stones, or gestures. Initial contact varied widely. Along the African coast, the Portuguese had been establishing trading relationships since the mid-15th century. In many places, especially West Africa, interactions were commercial, centered on gold, ivory, and later, tragically, enslaved people. Elsewhere, like in Brazil or the Indian subcontinent, the reception was more ambiguous, sometimes friendly, sometimes tense. Sailors were instructed to show religious symbols, offer gifts, and observe customs carefully, though their cultural understanding was often shallow at best. One recurring tactic was to erect crosses and stone markers padros, claiming territory in the name of the King of Portugal. These acts were symbolic to the Portuguese, but meaningless or provocative to locals. The language barrier. Communication was one of the most immediate challenges. Most sailors spoke only Portuguese or regional dialects. They relied heavily on gestures, drawings, or, occasionally, the help of interpreters, often Africans, Arabs, or Jews who had been pressed into service or acquired along earlier voyages. The confusion led to misinterpretation and sometimes comedy or catastrophe. Words for gifts could be confused with threats. A smile could be taken as a smirk. Religious gestures, particularly the cross, could be misunderstood or even seen as symbols of sorcery or domination. The solution was often crude. Show strength, give gifts, hope for trust, and be ready for violence. Shore leave, a break from sea's misery. For the sailors themselves, landfall brought long-awaited relief. Fresh water was their first need. Crews filled barrels from rivers, wells, or springs. Fresh food, including fruit, meat, and greens, offered temporary salvation from scurvy and starvation. Dry land meant a chance to sleep without rocking, to bathe in rivers, and to walk with steady feet. Sometimes they built makeshift camps, pitching tents or constructing temporary huts along the shore. If contact with locals was peaceful, they might engage in trade, swapping beads, knives, cloth, and iron goods for food, animal skins, or ornaments. Sailors also sometimes took advantage of this downtime to repair their ships, scrape barnacles, and replace rigging or sails. But shore leave was a double-edged sword. It exposed crews to new diseases, venomous animals, and potential ambush. Relaxation could easily turn to carelessness, and many men never made it back to the ship. Encounters with the other. For many Portuguese sailors, the people they met were utterly unlike anything they'd imagined. In Africa, they encountered complex kingdoms, bustling trade centers, and sophisticated societies. In India, markets overwhelmed them with silks, spices, precious stones, and strange instruments. In Brazil, they met indigenous groups who lived in forested villages and practiced customs the Portuguese could not easily classify. These encounters were not one-sided. Locals observed the Europeans just as curiously, often with amusement, suspicion, or contempt. The sailors' smell, clothing, and habits such as eating salted meat or kneeling to wooden figures seemed bizarre. Many locals found Europeans physically unimpressive and their demands confusing. While Portuguese captains hoped to make grand impressions, most sailors were dirty, ill, and poorly equipped. In some places, these men were tolerated, in others, feared, and in still others, they were welcomed, especially where locals saw potential for trade or alliance. But underlying every meeting was a tension, the imbalance of power, which could shift in an instant. Barter, curiosity, and conflict. Barter was the most common form of exchange. A sailor might trade a metal knife for several coconuts, a glass bead for a carved figure, a cloth tunic for local herbs or food. These exchanges were often inequitable, but both parties judged value differently. Sailors prized practical goods, food, fresh water, spices. Locals prized metal, tools, and novelty items. But barter could also turn to theft, misunderstanding, or violence. If a deal went wrong, fights could break out. If a sailor violated local customs, stepping into a sacred site, insulting a village elder, or even touching someone improperly, the result could be sudden reprisal. And when crews retaliated, it was often disproportionate. A few missing beads might lead to a village burned, a skirmish fought, or hostages taken. These incidents escalated over time and left lasting scars. Disease and death. Even peaceful landfalls carried danger. European sailors brought with them smallpox, influenza, and measles, diseases to which many indigenous populations had no immunity. The sailors themselves often died from malaria, dysentery, or tropical fevers picked up during their stays. Portuguese ships in the 16th century lost up to 30% of their crews to illness on longer voyages. Some were buried hastily on foreign shores. Others died aboard, their bodies sewn into sailcloth and slid into the sea with a prayer. Very few ordinary sailors left behind names. Most were lost to the waves, the shore, or the unmarked graves of empire. And yet the journey continued. Despite all this, the caravels kept coming. From Lisbon, from Porto, from Lagos, year after year. The voyages grew longer, the routes more complex. Spices were loaded by the ton, along with silk, sugar, and soon enslaved people. The empire was taking shape, not from grand strategy alone, but from the weary footprints of men who walked foreign sands, bartered for food, died in strange lands, and left behind traces of their passage. And still one question remains. What did these sailors bring home with them aside from goods? How did their world views, cultures, and beliefs change after seeing so much of the unknown? The sails are patched. The hull is heavier with cargo. The ship has taken on bundles of spices, pepper, cloves, nutmeg, and perhaps gold, cotton, ivory, or even exotic animals. Some of the crew are missing, buried in foreign soil or lost at sea. Those who remain prepare for the return voyage to Lisbon, their minds filled with memories, some wondrous, some terrible. This is not the triumphant homecoming of kings or explorers with trumpets blaring. This is the quiet endurance of the ordinary seaman, battered, changed, and clinging to survival. The return trip across the Atlantic or around the Cape of Good Hope is as dangerous as the journey out. For many, it will be the final test. We step aboard once more to witness the homeward journey and what these sailors carried back with them, beyond the silks and spices. The weight of the hold. The main goal of the voyage was always profit. Spices, especially black pepper, were more valuable than gold. A small sack could earn a sailor several times his annual wage if he survived the return. Cargo was carefully stored. Spices were packed in barrels or sacks, lined with oilcloth to keep out moisture. Precious stones were sealed in casks or kept under watch in the captain's cabin. Rare goods like parrots, monkeys, or carved idols were sometimes brought home as curiosities or gifts for nobility. The extra weight slowed the ship, making it more vulnerable to storms and pirates. The temptation to overload the vessel was ever present and dangerous. Water barrels were refilled where possible, but by the midpoint of the voyage they were often spoiled, and food supplies began to rot. The same hardships resumed: hunger, thirst, and disease. The sea takes its toll again. Sailors returning home were not the same as when they left. Months or even years at sea had left them physically wrecked. Gums receded or bled from lingering scurvy. Muscles atrophied. Skin peeled and cracked from constant salt and sun. Many had lice, sores, or open wounds that never healed. A surprising number returned with impaired vision due to constant exposure to the sun's glare, and some went completely blind during long voyages. In extreme cases, survivors lost the ability to walk, their legs too weak or diseased to bear their weight. Emotional trauma was harder to see but no less real. Men who had faced mutiny, starvation, shipwreck, or combat bore invisible scars. Some returned silent, others restless, their lives forever altered. Arrival in Lisbon, rebirth or ruin. As the caravels limped into the port of Lisbon, the city would buzz with anticipation. Families lined the docks. Merchants prepared their scales. Officials from the Casa de India, the Portuguese Crown's trade office, stood ready to inspect cargo and collect duties. For sailors, the return brought pay, often delayed or disputed, food and rest, a chance to visit families, churches, or taverns, and for the few lucky ones, social advancement or new opportunities. But not all were celebrated. Many were dismissed and forgotten, their contributions overshadowed by captains and chroniclers. Some died within weeks of arriving home, their bodies worn past repair. What the sailors brought back. Beyond physical goods, sailors carried knowledge often unrecorded, passed down only in dockside tailies or muttered warnings. They spoke of foreign peoples with strange customs, deadly plants and healing herbs, currents and stars that helped or hindered, ports where deals could be struck and where a man might vanish. These stories became part of the maritime lore of Portugal, shaping future voyages, songs, and even superstitions. A sailor might return with a tattoo, a foreign trinket, or even a child born of a relationship abroad, though such unions were rarely acknowledged in Europe. He might return with converted beliefs, new fears, or a deep skepticism of the church and crown. Some returned wealthy, some ruined, some broken, but nearly all returned changed. The silent architects of empire. While kings and viceroys plotted conquests, the sailors were the ones who laid the groundwork of empire without titles, without land, and without fanfare. They built and manned the fleets. They carried the goods. They translated the languages, broke the soil, and bled on the beachheads. Their work made empire possible, but it was often erased in the stories told later. They were witnesses to history, but rarely authors of it. And when they disappeared, lost at sea, swallowed by the tide of time, they left behind only traces, not in books, but in fragments of cargo, coastal graves, and half-remembered tailies. The price of passage. These sailors, so often anonymous, carried more than barrels of spice. They brought home the diseases of empire, the first drafts of colonial knowledge, and the habits of global capitalism. They lived and died in narrow hammocks, in hostile jungles under unfamiliar stars. They were expendable and they knew it. But without them, no empire could sail. No treaty could be enforced. No city of stone could rise in Goa, Malacca, or Salvador. Final reflection. Forgotten lives, enduring echoes. What does it mean that so much of global history was built on the backs of men we cannot name? What echoes remain from the lives spent scraping mold from biscuit, pulling ropes in storm winds, or dying quietly in the belly of a ship? And as we trace the grand arcs of empires, roots, and conquests, should we not also remember the simple sailor, hunched under canvas, dreaming of home? Story 4. The conquest of Ceuta, Portugal's first overseas colony. The scent of war is thick in the Mediterranean air. Not the grand wars of later centuries, fought over continents and colonies, but a smaller, more symbolic clash where religion, trade, and empire collided on a single strip of land. This is Ceuta, a fortified port city perched on the North African coast, staring across the Strait of Gibraltar toward Spain. For centuries, Ceuta had been a vital Islamic trade center, a gateway between Africa and Europe, a stopping point for caravans carrying gold, salt, slaves, and stories from the deep Sahara. But in the early 15th century, it became something else, the beginning of the European colonial age. Before caravels ventured around Africa, before da Gama found India, before Brazil was discovered, there was Ceuta, and its conquest would change the fate of Portugal forever. Portugal in 1415, a small kingdom with big ambitions. At the start of the 15th century, Portugal was still a relatively minor kingdom, hemmed in by Castile on one side and the Atlantic on the other. But it was stable, wealthy from maritime trade, and ruled by an ambitious young monarch, King João I, founder of the Aves dynasty. He had recently secured his throne in the 1383–1385 crisis, a power struggle that ended with Portuguese independence preserved and Castile repelled. Now, with internal stability in hand, João sought a new kind of glory. Ceuta offered it. It was a Muslim stronghold, a strategic trade hub, and a symbolic target. Capturing it would make Portugal a crusading power, give it a foothold in Africa, and open access to the trans-Saharan gold trade. It would also mark Portugal's first step, beyond the Iberian Peninsula, into imperial ambition. The road to Ceuta, planning the assault. By 1415, Ceuta had been under Muslim control for over 500 years. Its position made it both vulnerable and critical, like a cork in the bottle of the Mediterranean. Portuguese spies gathered intelligence. Maps were drawn, supplies amassed, but the most significant factor behind the attack was the royal family itself. King João's sons, Prince Duarte, Prince Pedro, and most famously, Prince Henrique, later known as Henry the Navigator, were eager to prove themselves. Warfare was the path to prestige. Ceuta was the proving ground. The campaign was framed not only as a military conquest but as a holy mission. Papal approval was secured. Clergy blessed the fleet. The rhetoric of crusade was revived, with echoes of earlier Christian-Muslim conflicts. But the true motivation was as much economic as spiritual. Portugal had long sought to tap into the gold and spice routes dominated by North African merchants. Ceuta stood at the edge of those riches. The siege begins, August 1415. On the morning of August 21, 1415, a fleet of around 200 Portuguese ships appeared off the coast of Ceuta, carrying an invasion force of nearly 45,000 men, soldiers, archers, nobles, and squires. The Muslim defenders, under the command of the Marinid governor, were caught by surprise. Though the city was well fortified, it was underdefended, the local sultan preoccupied with civil unrest in the heartlands of Morocco. The Portuguese assault was swift and brutal. Troops stormed the beaches under volleys of arrows. Siege engines battered the walls. Fires broke out in the lower districts. The gates were breached by evening. By nightfall, Ceuta had fallen. It was a decisive and total victory for the Portuguese. The city was plundered, though the pillaging was reportedly restrained compared to other medieval conquests, perhaps due to royal orders or a desire to preserve the city's infrastructure. The mosques were converted into churches, the crescent fell, the cross was raised. The aftermath, celebration and consequence. Back in Lisbon, the news was met with jubilation. Ceuta's capture was hailed as a divine victory. King João declared a national holiday, and songs were composed in praise of the conquest. But beneath the triumph, tension stirred. The occupation of Ceuta was expensive. The expected wealth, especially access to gold from the trans-Saharan trade, did not materialize as hoped. Muslim traders simply shifted routes inland or to other ports, bypassing Portuguese control. Moreover, Ceuta's garrison required constant resupply. Surrounded by hostile territory, the city was a military liability, constantly under siege from Moroccan forces. Yet despite these costs, Portugal held firm. Why? Because Ceuta was no longer just a city, it was a symbol of Portuguese strength, of Christian triumph, and of a future beyond Europe. Enter Henry, the navigator. Though he played only a minor role in the actual siege, Prince Henrique would become Ceuta's most important legacy. He saw in its conquest a gateway not just to Africa, but to the world beyond. Inspired by the city's position, he established a court in Sagres, where he sponsored voyages down the African coast, seeking new lands, allies, and trade routes. From Ceuta's walls, the vision of a maritime empire took root. The conquest, then, was not just a military campaign. It was the seed from which the age of discovery would grow. And yet the question remains: was the capture of Ceuta a victory or a costly mistake? Did it launch Portugal into greatness, or trap it in a cycle of unsustainable conquest? What happens when glory fades and the weight of empire begins to press down on a kingdom, still finding its place? Ceuta had fallen. The banners of Portugal flew from its ramparts. The churches rang with Christian hymns. The crescent moon was replaced with the cross, and in the streets below, Portuguese soldiers patrolled a city that had, for centuries, been Muslim. But as the fires of celebration died down and the plundered riches were spent or tallied, reality began to set in. The conquest of Ceuta had not brought the effortless wealth or strategic triumph that Portugal's nobles and monarchs had expected. What followed in the decades after 1415 was not glory, but occupation, attrition, and disillusionment. Ceuta was not the jewel of empire it had promised to be. It was, instead, a burden. We explore how Portugal struggled to hold onto its first overseas possession, and how the problems of Ceuta would shape the nature of future colonial expansion. Fortress on the edge. Ceuta, though captured quickly, was not easy to hold. It sat surrounded by hostile territory, its back to the sea, and its face to the mountains of Morocco. The Berber tribes and Moroccan sultanates that had once traded with the city now viewed it as a Christian intrusion. Almost immediately after its capture, Ceuta came under siege. The surrounding countryside was lost. Trade routes shifted to avoid the port. Supply lines from Portugal were long and vulnerable. To survive, Ceuta had to become a fortress militarized, insular, and dependent on constant support from the Portuguese crown. Troops had to be rotated regularly. Food was scarce. Disease spread quickly in the crowded and anxious garrison. Letters from the city's commanders frequently pleaded with Lisbon for reinforcements, money, and relief. Economic disappointment. Before the conquest, Portuguese hopes had been high. Ceuta had been viewed as a gateway to West African gold, a center of caravan trade, and a potential launchpad for further expansion. But those hopes quickly crumbled. Muslim merchants, savvy and mobile, simply diverted their routes to inland towns like Tetuan, Fez, or Tlemcen. Trade caravans that once passed through Ceuta now bypassed it completely. The city's commercial significance collapsed. Rather than enriching Portugal, Ceuta became a sinkhole of royal expenditure. King Joel had spent nearly one-fifth of the national treasury outfitting the original campaign. Now, the crown had to keep paying to defend and sustain a city that returned little more than symbolic value. Some chroniclers even began to question the wisdom of the conquest. In private circles, nobles who had once cheered the invasion now grumbled over its cost. But it was too late. Ceuta was Portugal's first overseas colony. To abandon it would be to admit defeat. Religious zeal and moral justification. Despite the economic disappointment, the religious and ideological framing of the conquest helped justify continued occupation. Church leaders praised the city as a foothold in the battle against Islam. Ceuta was portrayed as the beginning of a new crusade, a Christian spearhead into North Africa. Papal bulls gave Portugal spiritual authority to defend and expand its presence in the name of Christendom. These justifications masked more pragmatic concerns. If Ceuta had been abandoned, it would have emboldened enemies, weakened Portugal's international standing, and perhaps unraveled the momentum of maritime exploration just beginning to stir. In this way, ideology protected policy. Holding Ceuta became not just a choice, but a matter of national pride and divine mission. Ceuta and the rise of Prince Henry, the Navigator. Amid the stagnation in Ceuta, a new vision was forming, one that would reshape Portugal's approach to empire. Prince Henry, third son of King Joel I and a participant in the siege, took Ceuta's failure as a lesson. He understood that traditional land conquests in North Africa were expensive, politically complex, militarily unsustainable. Instead, Henry shifted his focus to the sea. From his base in Sagres, he sponsored voyages down the West African coast. These expeditions aimed to find a sea route to the gold-rich lands of sub-Saharan Africa, bypass Muslim-controlled trade networks, establish coastal trading posts rather than inland colonies. In a way, Ceuta taught Portugal how not to build an empire. The city had cost too much, yielded too little, and sparked near-constant conflict. Henry's vision was different: mobility, trade, and sea power over land-based conquest. Life in a colonial outpost. For the Portuguese soldiers, settlers, and officials stationed in Ceuta, daily life was grim. The city was constantly on alert for attack. Supplies from Portugal arrived irregularly. Disease and malnutrition were rampant. Morale was low, desertion was not uncommon. Few settlers volunteered to stay long. The city became known as a hardship post, reserved for soldiers of fortune, political exiles, or lower nobility seeking favor through suffering. Yet even in hardship, the Portuguese began to learn the rhythms of foreign governance. They developed early models of colonial administration, military command structures, clerical presence abroad, cultural coexistence and friction with non-Christian subjects. Ceuta, then, was a laboratory for empire imperfect, difficult but formative. A kingdom learns to adapt. By 1450, Portugal had begun to adjust its imperial aims. Expeditions along the African coast had reached Senegal and were approaching the Gambia River. Forts were constructed on offshore islands like Madeira and the Azores, where full settlement was more feasible. Navigation tools improved. Mariners gained experience. The failures of Ceuta did not halt expansion, they refined it. And so, the lessons of this dusty, besieged city, once thought to be the golden key to Africa, echoed across Portugal's growing maritime network. And still a lingering dilemma. Why did Portugal continue to hold Ceuta for so long despite its costs? Was it pride, faith, or something else? And how did the city's example influence the decisions made on later coasts where trade, not territory, became the preferred model? What happens when the first step toward empire teaches you exactly what not to do, yet you keep walking anyway? The red banner of Portugal still flew above Ceuta, but it no longer fluttered triumphantly. By the mid-15th century and well into the 16th, the city was a burden strategically awkward, economically disappointing, and militarily expensive. Yet Portugal held on. Through changes of dynasty, shifting tides of fortune, and a growing global empire that stretched from Brazil to India, Ceuta remained silent, stubborn, and largely forgotten by history. But it played an ongoing role, both symbolic and strategic, and its continued occupation reveals something crucial about the psychology and policies of early European colonialism. We explore how Portugal clung to Ceuta, what it came to represent over 2 centuries of occupation, and how its eventual fate marked the end of an era. Fortress Portugal, Ceuta in the shadow of empire. As Portugal's empire blossomed along the African coast and in the Indian Ocean, Ceuta became less a central prize and more an outpost, yet one imbued with deep symbolic meaning. The empire was now shifting toward trade dominance in spices and precious metals, naval power to enforce maritime tolls and coastal control, small strategic outposts rather than large land-based conquests. Still, Ceuta served as a military training ground, a gateway into North African affairs, and a symbol of Christian victory. Despite economic failure, it became a fixture of empire the first planted flag. However, this symbolism had a price. The garrison required constant royal funding. The surrounding territory remained hostile, and frequent attacks made any expansion impossible. The port's economic utility remained minimal, as Muslim traders continued to divert routes inland or elsewhere. Despite this, no Portuguese king dared abandon Ceuta. It was considered dishonorable, a retreat in the face of Islam, a blemish on royal prestige, and a contradiction to the idea of divine mission. Ceuta and the Iberian Union, 1580–1640. In 1580, a dynastic crisis engulfed Portugal. King Sebastian had died in Morocco in 1578 during a failed crusade-like invasion, and with no direct heir, the Portuguese crown passed to the King of Spain, Philip II. Thus began the Iberian Union, in which Portugal and Spain were ruled by the same monarch for 60 years. Under Spanish control, Portugal's empire continued in name, but increasingly operated under Spanish military and diplomatic strategies. Ceuta, now technically a Spanish possession through dynastic union, became even more militarized, its population shrinking and its economy withering. In 1640, Portugal rebelled and re-established its independence under the House of Braganza. The entire Portuguese Empire, Brazil, Angola, India reaffirmed loyalty to the new Portuguese king. But not Ceuta. The city's leaders, fearful of instability and perhaps having grown culturally closer to Spain during the Union, declared loyalty to the Spanish crown instead. It was a remarkable twist. The first overseas colony of Portugal became one of its only possessions not to return to the fold after independence. The Treaty of Lisbon, 1668, a final goodbye. The decades that followed were filled with skirmishes, diplomatic negotiations, and disputes over imperial boundaries. By 1668, the Treaty of Lisbon formally ended the Portuguese Restoration War and established peaceful relations between Portugal and Spain. Included in the treaty was a provision: Spain would retain Ceuta. And so, after 253 years of Portuguese rule, Ceuta was gone, not lost in battle, but yielded by diplomacy. It would become part of the Spanish realm permanently, and remains so today. Legacy of Ceuta. In the grand sweep of colonial history, Ceuta often receives little attention. It lacked the spice wealth of India, the plantations of Brazil, or the geopolitical drama of later conquests. But its legacy is profound. Ceuta marked the beginning of Europe's shift from land-bound kingdoms to maritime empires. It introduced Portugal to the difficulties of overseas occupation logistics, supply chains, and resistance. It cemented the ideology of conquest as divine mission, with the papacy and church blessing expansion. It set the stage for a different model of Empire One, based less on land and more on mobility, trade, and fortification. For over 2 centuries, Ceuta served as a symbol of ambition, miscalculation, pride, and persistence. It was a lesson in overreach and a warning that not all victories lead to gain. Final reflection: the empire before the empire. In the end, Ceuta was not about gold, glory, or even faith. It was about testing the limits of a kingdom's will. It taught Portugal that conquest is not an end, but a beginning that demands more than swords and banners. It demands endurance. And perhaps that is Ceuta's final lesson. What do you do with a prize that proves more costly than the fight to win it? And how long do you hold on before you admit the battle was not the hard part, keeping it was? Story 5. The Forgotten Navigator, The Voyages of João de Nova. The name João de Nova is rarely spoken alongside da Gama, Magellan, or Columbus. And yet, in the fading light of the 15th century, as Europe's sails cut deeper into the Indian Ocean, it was João de Nova who helped map new waters, establish outposts, and quietly carry the empire forward. This is the story of a navigator largely forgotten by history, despite achievements that shaped the course of Portuguese expansion. A man whose journeys filled in the empty spaces left by more famous names. A man who built and was buried by the empire he helped to expand. Origins of an obscure explorer. João de Nova was born around 1460, possibly in Galicia, Spain, though he would live much of his adult life in Portugal. Little is known of his early years, a common trait for navigators not born into noble blood or elevated by myth. By the 1490s, he had settled in Lisbon and joined the ranks of Portugal's growing seafaring class. He likely studied navigation, cartography, and ship-handling in Sagres, where Prince Henry's vision of maritime empire had laid the groundwork for a new class of explorers. Nova entered royal service as an administrator and customs official, eventually rising to Alcaide of Lisbon, a position of responsibility that placed him at the heart of Portugal's commercial and naval activity. He was trusted, competent, loyal. And so, in 1501, when King Manuel I organized a new expedition to the Indian Ocean, João de Nova was given command. The fleet of 1501, a new phase of empire. By the turn of the century, Portugal had already achieved what once seemed impossible. Vasco da Gama had reached India. Cabral had accidentally landed in Brazil. A permanent sea route from Europe to Asia had been established. But Portugal's hold in the Indian Ocean was tenuous. Relationships with Indian rulers were unstable. Muslim merchants resisted Portuguese intrusion. The seas were vast and only partially charted. João de Nova's mission was to follow up, secure trade, and establish outposts, a quieter, more technical role than da Gama's dramatic first contact. He set out in 1501 with 4 ships, carrying goods for trade, supplies for new settlements, and orders to explore further down the East African and Indian coasts. What followed was a voyage marked not by grand spectacle, but by quiet milestones crucial for empire, yet often ignored by glory-seeking chronicles. The discovery of islands. One of de Nova's most notable achievements occurred before he even reached India. In the South Atlantic, on the return from the Cape of Good Hope, he discovered and named 2 islands. Ascension Island, found on Ascension Day, 1501. St. Helena, discovered in May 1502. These barren volcanic outcrops would, in time, become vital resupply points for the Portuguese Empire. St. Helena, in particular, would serve as a freshwater stop and eventually host gardens and livestock for passing ships. Though uninhabited and inhospitable, such islands were gold to long-distance seafarers. They provided fresh water, wild goats and pigs, a place to bury the dead and make repairs. And for the empire, they offered markers, dots of Portuguese control in an otherwise empty ocean. Da Nova's name remains attached to these places, even if history has misplaced his face. Arrival in India, a sea already troubled. Da Nova arrived in India in 1501 or early 1502, entering a world already strained. The relationship between the Portuguese and the Zamorin of Calicut, India's dominant coastal ruler, had soured. Earlier Portuguese fleets had bombarded cities, taken hostages, and demanded monopolies on the spice trade. Da Nova attempted to avoid conflict and focus on trading pepper. He successfully loaded cargo at Cannes, modern Cannes, where Portugal had better diplomatic relations. But trouble followed. As he attempted to leave, he encountered a fleet of Arab Muslim ships, possibly backed by Calicut. A sea battle ensued, the Battle of Cannes, 1502, which Da Nova's fleet survived, but only narrowly. It was a sign of things to come. A foothold, the first European fortress in India. After the battle, Da Nova turned his attention to establishing a permanent presence. He built a feitoria, trading post, at Cannes, the first European fortification in India. Small and fortified with palisades and stone, it served as both a warehouse for spices and a defensive post. It marked the beginning of Portugal's strategy of forts over conquest, a pattern repeated in Goa, Malacca, Hormuz, and beyond. Though often overlooked in comparison to grander fortresses built later, this outpost laid the foundation for Portugal's long presence in India. And yet recognition was elusive. Despite his achievements, Da Nova did not receive the acclaim of his peers. He did not conquer a great city. He did not bring home a fleet of treasure. He did not die in a blaze of glory. Instead, he was reassigned, sidelined, and forgotten. He would later serve under the fiery Afonso de Albuquerque, Portugal's empire builder in the east, but the two men clashed bitterly. Da Nova was said to be cautious and pragmatic, while Albuquerque was aggressive and visionary. Their conflict would shape the final chapter of Da Nova's life. And still unanswered questions. Why was Da Nova passed over for higher honors? Was it his temperament, his background, or simply the misfortune of serving in an age where fame required fire? What happens to the men who build empires brick by brick, but leave behind no epic poem or bloody siege to mark their name? The Indian Ocean is not calm. It is not the silent stage that 15th-century European kings and chroniclers imagined. By the time João da Nova sails its waters, the ocean is alive with resistance, Arab traders, Indian rulers, African city-states, all navigating, resisting, or negotiating with the sudden and forceful arrival of the Portuguese. In this turbulent world, João da Nova finds himself not as a hero, but as a functionary caught between rival commanders, competing visions of empire, and the sheer chaos of imperial ambition. We follow Da Nova's continued career in the Indian Ocean, focusing not on discovery but on survival, conflict, and the thankless reality of holding empire together. For every battle won, there was a conflict within. For every port secured, a political alliance threatened to break. Afonso de Albuquerque, the empire's iron hand. In 1505, King Manuel I appointed Dom Francisco de Almeida as the first viceroy of Portuguese India, to impose order on the growing imperial holdings. João da Nova likely served under Almeida in these early years, overseeing and resupplying the outposts he helped to establish. But the real turning point came with the arrival of Afonso de Albuquerque in 1506. Albuquerque was a visionary and a storm. His dream was not just to trade spices, but to conquer the Indian Ocean. He envisioned a string of fortified naval bases from East Africa to Southeast Asia, a defensive wall of Portuguese power choking off Muslim trade and permanently embedding Portugal into Asia. He was bold, ruthless, and highly favored by the crown. João de Nova, by contrast, was pragmatic. He preferred negotiation over conquest, stability over provocation. The two men could not have been more different. Clashes in the fleet. By 1506, de Nova was in command of a ship in a fleet led by Tristão de Cunha, heading toward the Persian Gulf and India. Albuquerque was also aboard, but with a separate mission to secure key ports through military means. Tensions quickly emerged. Albuquerque took charge aggressively, issuing orders with little consultation. He wanted to lay siege to Ormuz, a critical Persian Gulf trading hub, despite opposition from many officers including João de Nova. De Nova argued against the attack. He saw it as dangerous, premature, and diplomatically reckless. He wanted to follow the original plan, resupply outposts, conduct reconnaissance, and avoid open war. Albuquerque saw opposition as insubordination. The Siege of Ormuz, 1507, resistance from within. Despite internal dissent, Albuquerque pressed forward and launched an attack on Ormuz, on the island of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf, a glittering prize in the region's trade network. The siege was chaotic. The city's defenses were strong. The local Persian and Arab leaders resisted fiercely. While Albuquerque's cannons pounded the walls, internal strife consumed the fleet. João de Nova, along with other captains, refused to provide full support. Albuquerque retaliated. He accused de Nova of insubordination, removed him from command, and allegedly had him imprisoned aboard his own ship. This was not the romantic story of empire. It was a bureaucratic mutiny, a slow collapse of professional trust. Captains whispered among themselves. Morale plummeted. Eventually, with reinforcements months away, Albuquerque was forced to abandon Ormuz temporarily. He would later return and take the city, but only after replacing nearly all of his opposition with more loyal officers. An explorer disgraced. For João de Nova, this episode marked the end of his active career. He was publicly humiliated. He lost the favor of the viceroy and the crown. He returned to Cochin, one of Portugal's few stable strongholds in India, where he fell gravely ill. In 1509, João de Nova died not in battle, not at sea, but quietly, likely from tropical disease or exhaustion. He was buried in Cochin, far from Lisbon, far from recognition. There was no hero's return, no statue, no poem. Just a grave in a foreign land. A reputation forgotten, then misremembered. João de Nova's name was not wholly erased. Over the centuries, he would be remembered as a discoverer of Atlantic islands, St. Helena and Ascension, a builder of the first Portuguese feitoria in India, a key figure in early Portuguese naval campaigns. But his legacy was overshadowed by more dramatic figures: da Gama, Cabral, Albuquerque, men whose stories better fit the imperial mythos of bold conquests and divine destiny. De Nova was none of those things. He was, in many ways, a professional sailor and administrator, someone who understood the realities of empire building and who questioned the zealotry of expansion. In doing so, he paid the price. And still the question persists. What would Portugal's empire have looked like if João de Nova's vision had prevailed? If diplomacy, not domination, had defined its engagement with Asia? Can an empire be built by caution and reason, or only by ambition and fire? João de Nova died far from home. No royal send-off, No grand eulogy, just another grave in Cochin, Portugal's new outpost in a land it had only begun to know. He was buried among men like him, sailors, soldiers, scribes, tools of empire, not authors of its myths. Yet even in his obscurity, João de Nova left behind more than forgotten voyages and a disputed legacy. He helped shape the framework of the Portuguese imperial presence in Asia, its methods, its moral boundaries, and its maritime infrastructure. His story is not one of glorious conquest, but of quiet competence, internal descent, and an enduring influence that outlasted his own name. This final section traces that influence. It is not a biography, it is a meditation on how the edges of history shape the center, and how de Nova's contributions, though silenced in chronicles, were built into the foundations of empire. The architecture of empire. Though de Nova died in 1509, the Feitoria trading post he built in Canner would outlive him by centuries. It became a model, fortified but modest in scale, designed to store spices, house diplomats, and serve as a foothold in hostile or neutral territory. Manned not by armies but by clerks, interpreters, and a small guard. This model was replicated again and again. At Cochin, where de Nova was buried. In Malacca, captured in 1511 by Afonso de Albuquerque. In Mozambique, Hormuz, and Macau. Portugal's empire was not primarily territorial. It was maritime and mercantile. And de Nova, as a naval administrator, helped shape that orientation not by philosophy, but through action. His ships, his fortifications, his trade contacts all helped define what a Portuguese presence should look like. Pragmatic, light-footed, and embedded within existing trade structures, at least at first. Even in his disagreements with Albuquerque, de Nova revealed an alternate path for Empire One based more on stability and diplomacy, less on total domination. St. Helena and Ascension, markers in the ocean. The islands João de Nova discovered St. Helena and Ascension, became key to Portugal's global reach. They were uninhabited, reducing conflict with local populations. Remote, ideal for resupply away from hostile coasts. Geostrategic, falling along return routes from the Indian Ocean to Lisbon. St. Helena would become particularly important. It provided fresh water, critical after months at sea. A place to restock provisions. A site to bury the dead or repair ships. Later in the 17th and 18th centuries, other European powers, including the Dutch and British, would use and fight over these islands. They were minor dots on the map, but in an age when oceans were highways and lifelines, such dots were invaluable, and they bore the quiet fingerprint of João de Nova. The ghost in the journals. After de Nova's death, his name appeared sporadically in royal correspondence and official reports. He was mentioned as a commander of the 1501 fleet, cited in early records of naval skirmishes off India's coast, referenced in letters from Afonso de Albuquerque, mostly critically. But unlike his contemporaries, he left no journal, no court chronicler devoted to his deeds, no grand monument. This too is telling. His story reveals the limits of recognition in early modern empire. He was not from the highest nobility. He did not die in a blaze of patriotic martyrdom. He did not conquer a city or command a viceroyalty. And so history marginalized him. Yet the empire he helped to establish through labor, logistics, and loyalty stood for centuries. The empire's fragile foundations. By the mid-16th century, Portugal's empire spanned Brazil, rich in sugar plantations and enslaved labor. Africa, dotted with forts and slaving posts. India, where Goa became the seat of Portuguese Asia. The Spice Islands, where trade wars and piracy reigned. China and Japan, newly contacted but wary. And beneath these conquests were men like João de Nova, not visionaries, but implementers, men who turned imperial plans into real, functioning systems. They mapped coastlines, built and repaired ships, maintained fragile alliances, logged cargo and taxes, died from fevers in foreign outposts. They were not the empire's face, but they were its hands. Final reflection, the legacy of the overlooked. João de Nova was not erased. He was simply overwritten, his lines lost beneath bolder strokes. But his story matters precisely because it shows that empires are not only built by heroes and tyrants. They are built by navigators who kept logs, argued with their commanders, buried their crew on volcanic islands, and died in borrowed quarters far from home. His was a life unromantic, practical, and essential. He may never be remembered in textbooks, nor cast in bronze, but his shadow sails with every story of the age of discovery. Final questions to consider. What other lives buried in forgotten ports, or in the margins of dusty archives, shaped history as much as kings and conquerors? And how different would our understanding of the past be if we looked not only at those who led, but also those who served, endured, and disagreed? Story 6. The Fall of Malacca Empire Meets Trade. You stand on the shores of Malacca, where the strait narrows like the throat of an hourglass. Every ship between China and India must pass through this channel, hundreds of sails, hundreds of voices, and hundreds of cargoes, all funneling through a city that smells of cloves, seawater, and opportunity. Before cannons ever fired or crosses were raised, Malacca was already a global city. Here, long before European ships arrived, trade routes from the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea converged in a cosmopolitan harbor town governed not by brute force, but by diplomacy, customs, and commerce. And so, when the Portuguese arrived, they didn't discover Malacca, they disrupted it. The story of Malacca's fall is not just one of conquest. It is the story of how Europe's ambitions collided with Asia's existing systems, and how a single city's capture changed the very character of empire. The rise of a maritime crossroads. Malacca, or Malacca, was founded around 1400 CE by a Sumatran prince, Paramiswara, who converted to Islam and aligned himself with powerful Muslim trading networks. By the 15th century, it had grown into one of the busiest ports in the world. Key features of Malacca's rise. Strategic location. It controlled the narrow strait between the Malay Peninsula and Sumatra, through which nearly all maritime trade between East Asia and the Indian Ocean passed. Religious tolerance. Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, and even some Christian merchants lived side by side. Administrative innovation. The Sultanate of Malacca developed a code of maritime law, the Undang-Undang Laut Malacca, to regulate disputes and ensure fair trade. Cultural fluidity. Persian, Arab, Gujarati, Chinese, Javanese, and Burmese traders coexisted. The city was linguistically diverse and multi-ethnic by design. Malacca's success did not come from conquest, but from mutual interest in trade governance. Goods and gold, the pulse of a port. Every day, the harbor of Malacca was filled with vessels carrying spices from the Moluccas, cloves, nutmeg, mace, porcelain and silk from China, textiles from Gujarat, gold, tin, and camphor from the Malay world, elephants, ivory, and gems from Siam and Burma. Taxes were low, warehouses were ample, disputes were resolved by custom, not by sword. The Sultan, Mahmud Shah, ruled not as an autocrat but as a broker of networks. His authority rested on balancing relationships, diplomatic, religious, and economic. He maintained a military but rarely needed to use it. This was not a land-based empire. It was a floating market, bound together by tides and trade winds. Portugal turns east. After Vasco da Gama's successful journey to India in 1498, Portugal began to penetrate the Indian Ocean world, looking for ways to break the Muslim monopoly on the spice trade, dominate key ports through fortresses and cannon, forge a sea-based empire bypassing overland routes controlled by the Ottomans and Mamluks. By 1509, Portuguese ships had reached Malacca under the command of Diogo Lopes de Sequeira. At first they came as traders, but it did not go well. The local Muslim merchants, wary of Portuguese behavior elsewhere, warned the Sultan. Sequeira was attacked, several Portuguese were imprisoned. The survivors escaped and sailed back to Goa. From Lisbon to Cochin, this was taken as an insult, a betrayal, and more importantly, a challenge to Portuguese authority in the East. Afonso de Albuquerque prepares. In 1511, Afonso de Albuquerque, then governor of Portuguese India, assembled a fleet. Albuquerque was not a diplomat. He was a strategist and a conqueror, with ambitions to control every major trade chokepoint between the Atlantic and the Pacific. His goals for Malacca were clear. Establish a permanent Portuguese base in Southeast Asia. Break the regional Islamic trading networks. Create a naval chokepoint to force Asian traders into Portuguese terms of trade. This was a calculated, brutal escalation. While earlier expeditions had hoped to negotiate, Albuquerque intended to take the city by force. The city unaware. Back in Malacca, Sultan Mahmud Shah remained confident. He believed the Portuguese were just another trading fleet, powerful, yes, but outnumbered and unprepared for a real siege. He counted on local geography, a fortified palace, and a loyal army to hold the city. But Malacca's very nature, open, diverse, and unmilitarized, would become its weakness. It had grown wealthy through openness, not defense. Its walls were thin, its soldiers few, and many of its residents, Chinese, Indian, Javanese, were indifferent or even hostile to the ruling sultanate. When the Portuguese fleet approached again in mid-1511, it would find not a united city ready for war, but a complex web of alliances, rivalries, and vulnerabilities. And yet the siege had not begun. What happens when a world built on negotiation meets a force that speaks only in gunpowder? How would a cosmopolitan trading city withstand a siege meant not just to conquer it, but to change the rules of trade entirely? What do you do when the empire doesn't want to trade, but to own? The Portuguese arrived in force, not as merchants but as a flotilla of floating fortresses. In mid-1511, Afonso de Albuquerque's fleet appeared on the horizon, its sails taut with ambition and gunpowder. There were 18 ships, 1,200 men, and a clear directive: Malacca must fall. This was not a spontaneous assault. It was a meticulously planned operation to seize the most valuable trade hub in Southeast Asia, a city not fortified for war, but for commerce. What followed was not just a siege, but a revelation. How a European empire new to Asia would treat a cosmopolitan, independent, and peaceful trading city that stood in the way of imperial logic. This was the moment the rules changed. Albuquerque's strategy: divide and dismantle. Before launching his attack, Albuquerque studied the city carefully. Malacca had some walls and a palace, but most of its defenses were symbolic. The real challenge was the geographic complexity: a city of canals, marketplaces, and jetties, interlaced with alleys and wooden bridges. Albuquerque moved with methodical aggression. He anchored in the harbor and demanded surrender. When Sultan Mahmud Shah refused, he began negotiating with discontented locals, especially Chinese merchants who had grievances with the Sultan's regime. He built a makeshift stockade on land, converting parts of the shore into artillery platforms. He sent envoys and spies to gather information about the palace, the army, and the tides. His genius lay not in overwhelming force, but in understanding that Malacca was held together by trade, not by loyalty. If he could crack the networks, the city would fall. The first assault, July 1511. On July 25, 1511, Albuquerque launched the first major attack. Portuguese soldiers disembarked at low tide, storming across mudflats and bridges toward the central mosque, a symbolic and strategic point near the Sultan's palace. The defenders fought back with matchlocks, arrows, and small cannon. The city's wooden structures caught fire, creating chaos. After hours of brutal hand-to-hand combat in narrow streets, Albuquerque ordered a retreat. The Portuguese suffered heavy casualties, but they had learned valuable lessons: the layout of the city, the strength of its resistance, and critically that the Sultan's army was smaller and less coordinated than expected. A city of many loyalties. During the lull between attacks, Albuquerque intensified his political maneuvers. He made alliances with Chinese merchants, offering them tax reductions and protection; Tamil and Hindu residents, who resented the Sultan's religious favoritism; former palace officials, bribed to provide information or even sabotage the defense. He promised not to loot non-Muslim property, not to destroy temples, and to protect the trading infrastructure. This strategy turned Malacca's diversity, once its strength, into a vulnerability. The city was fragmenting from within, even as cannons battered its walls from without. The final assault, August 1511. On August 10, 1511, Albuquerque launched his final all-out attack. This time the Portuguese landed forces from two sides, creating confusion; used naval artillery to suppress palace defenses; deployed grenades and fire weapons, terrifying defenders unused to such tools; took control of the central mosque, then pressed toward the Sultan's palace. The defenders, outgunned and demoralized, fell back. By mid-August, the palace had been captured. Sultan Mahmud Shah fled into the jungle along with a remnant of his loyalists. The Portuguese had taken the city. But conquest was not the end. It was the beginning of something far more transformative and far more violent in its subtleties. Aftermath: restructuring the trade machine. Albuquerque did not raise Malacca, he re-engineered it. Within weeks, a Portuguese fortress, the A Famosa, was under construction. European-style taxes and licenses were imposed on all merchants. Muslim officials were removed or replaced. Portuguese became the language of administration. But he also knew Malacca's value was its trade infrastructure, so he reopened the port to Chinese and Javanese ships, maintained the city's commercial courts, guaranteed safety for non-Muslim traders. This was not simple pillage. It was the first major example of European colonial administration in Asia, a hybrid system where military force installed a new elite, but economic function remained intact, albeit now under European terms. Sultan Mahmud's resistance. Sultan Mahmud Shah did not vanish. From his base in the interior, he mounted guerrilla resistance for years, raiding caravans, attempting to blockade the harbor, calling on allies from Marseille, Johor, and the wider Muslim world. But the Portuguese had the harbor, the ships, and the flow of trade. Malacca's heart had been seized. The Sultan's resistance would eventually give birth to new Malay states, like Johor and Perak, but Malacca itself would remain under Portuguese control for over a century. The cost of conquest. The conquest of Malacca was a turning point. It marked Portugal's shift from trading participant to imperial enforcer. It exposed the vulnerability of cosmopolitan cities to military capital alliances. It introduced a new era in Southeast Asia, where European canon dictated terms of commerce. And for the people of Malacca, merchants, artisans, sailors, the change was profound. Life under the Portuguese meant new taxes, foreign rulers, and the end of Islamic political authority. The trade continued, but the city had changed. And yet questions remain. Can a city survive its own reinvention? Can a place built on openness and diversity remain itself when captured by a force that rewrites its rules? Or does the cost of conquest always include the loss of identity, hidden beneath the appearance of continuity? The cannon stopped, but the transformation had only just begun. In 1511, Malacca had fallen into Portuguese hands. But the empire Portugal hoped to control wasn't just made of ships and spices, it was made of people, languages, trade agreements, and centuries-old networks that did not easily bend to European will. The aftermath of the conquest of Malacca reveals a quieter struggle, a daily battle not of muskets and swords, but of bureaucracy, customs, resistance, and adaptation. In this section, we examine what happened after the city was taken, how the Portuguese managed and mismanaged their prize, and how Malacca's fall became both a symbol of European expansion and a warning about the limits of empire. A famosa, fortress and symbol. Almost immediately after seizing Malacca, Afonso de Albuquerque ordered the construction of a stone fortress, a famosa, or the famous one. It served three main purposes: military defense, in case of uprisings or return of Sultan Mahmud Shah; psychological presence, projecting European dominance in a foreign land; administrative control, housing officials, troops, and records. The fortress became the first European stronghold in Southeast Asia, later replicated across the region in Goa, Ternate, and Macau. But behind its walls, the Portuguese found themselves trying to govern a city they didn't fully understand. Trade resumes but changes hands. Albuquerque reopened Malacca's port quickly to avoid commercial collapse. He extended invitations to Chinese merchants, promising protection and low tariffs; Hindu and Tamil traders, many of whom had been alienated by the Muslim elite; Javanese shippers, whose networks reached as far as Bali and Borneo. The spice trade continued. Porcelain, silk, camphor, tin, and pepper still moved through the port. But the Muslim trading community along the city's backbone withdrew. Many left for safer, independent cities like Aceh or Banten. Over time, Malacca's profile changed. From cosmopolitan hub to colonial garrison. From Islamic entrepot to Christian-administered outpost. From organic city to imperial experiment. This shift did not destroy Malacca's economy, but it displaced its identity. Resistance beyond the walls. Sultan Mahmud Shah refused to vanish into history. From inland bases, he launched guerrilla raids on Portuguese outposts. His sons rallied support in the region, particularly among Malay nobles, loyal to the old order; Acehnese and Javanese rulers, alarmed by Portuguese aggression; Muslim merchants, threatened by Christian naval dominance. These efforts failed to retake Malacca, but they fractured Portuguese control. Supply lines were harassed. Local revolts flared. Trust eroded between European rulers and Southeast Asian subjects. In response, the Portuguese built more fortifications, imposed heavier taxes, and restricted travel. But cracks had already formed. Malacca was never as valuable to Portugal as it had been before the conquest. The long decline. Over the following century, Malacca slowly lost ground to other rising powers. Aceh grew in strength, becoming a dominant Islamic state and regional trade rival. The Dutch East India Company, VOC, arrived in the 1600s, offering better trade terms and military alliances. Local trade patterns shifted, bypassing Malacca in favor of less militarized ports. By the early 17th century, Malacca was militarily overextended, economically stagnant, politically isolated. Then in 1641, the Dutch, allied with Sultan Iskandar Muta of Aceh, captured Malacca, ending Portuguese rule after 130 years. The fortress of Famosa was partially demolished. The city, once the jewel of the Portuguese Empire in Asia, had become a relic of failed ambitions. Legacy and reflection. The fall of Malacca to the Portuguese in 1511 marked a new era, one where European colonialism became a permanent feature in Asia. It was the first major European conquest of an Asian port city, a turning point in the spread of Christianity, European law, and mercantile systems in the East, a harbinger of centuries of conflict, negotiation, and hybrid governance structures between Europeans and Asian polities. But it also taught hard lessons: that military conquest could not replace trade relationships overnight, that diverse cities resist homogenization, even under cannons, that imperial power, no matter how advanced, must contend with local knowledge, networks, and resistance. Malacca's story is not just about a siege, it is about what happens when empires occupy markets and how cities, like people, remember what they once were. Final thoughts. In the end, Malacca survived its many conquests. Today, it stands as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, its streets bearing the traces of Malay sultans, Portuguese priests, Dutch merchants, and British colonial officers. Yet when you walk those narrow lanes and pass the ruins of a Famosa, you might still ask, can a city ever truly recover from being conquered not just in war, but in spirit? And what is lost not just in buildings and banners, but in the silences left behind? Story 7. The Portuguese in Ethiopia: Faith and Firearms. It began with a legend. Somewhere in the east, beyond deserts and mountains, there was said to be a Christian king who ruled a vast empire. His name, according to European myth, was Prester John. For centuries, European rulers and clergy believed he could be found in Asia. But by the 15th century, hope turned to Africa, where the ancient Christian kingdom of Ethiopia offered a compelling reality for this long-imagined ally. When the Portuguese finally reached India, and then the Red Sea, they turned their gaze inland toward the Ethiopian highlands. What followed was a complex dance of religion, diplomacy, warfare, and survival between two ancient powers: the highland Christian kingdom of Ethiopia and the sea-borne Catholic Empire of Portugal. This is not a story of conquest, but of alliance and its costs. It is about faith, trust, muskets, and misunderstandings, and it all began with the belief that one Christian kingdom could save another. The Christian kingdom of Ethiopia. Long before the Portuguese came, Ethiopia had already been Christian for nearly 1,000 years. The kingdom of Aksum, flourishing from the 1st to 7th centuries CE, had adopted Christianity as early as the 4th century, making Ethiopia one of the oldest Christian nations in the world. The Ethiopian Church, while aligned with Alexandrian Coptic Christianity, developed its own customs, saints, and scriptures. Surrounded by Islamic states and cut off from the rest of Christian Europe after the rise of Islam, Ethiopia became isolated but not forgotten. By the 15th century, the Solomonic dynasty ruled from the Central Highlands. Its kings claimed descent from the biblical union of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. The empire was deeply religious, fiercely independent, and constantly at war, especially with the Muslim sultanates of the lowlands. Ethiopia was both fortress and pilgrimage site, a kingdom proud of its faith, yet wary of the world beyond its mountains. The myth of Prester John. The idea of Prester John, an Eastern Christian monarch who would one day come to the aid of Christendom, circulated in Europe since the 12th century. In letters forged or misinterpreted over the centuries, he was said to rule a land of immense wealth, strange beasts, and unwavering faith. The Mongol Empire briefly revived the myth, but when contact with Asia failed to confirm his existence, European attention shifted to Africa. By the 15th century, with the Reconquista completed and Portugal sailing past the western coasts of Africa, explorers and kings turned their attention to Ethiopia. They believed they had found Prester John at last. It wasn't true, but it was close enough. First contact, diplomatic feelers 1400s. In the mid-1400s, the Ethiopian Emperor Zara Yaqub sent envoys to Europe, hoping to forge alliances against the rising threat of Islamic powers surrounding his kingdom. Portugal responded slowly. Early missions were dispatched to Cairo and Aden, seeking safe passage. In 1493, King Manuel I of Portugal sent emissaries to Ethiopia, but they never arrived, lost to the vast deserts and political labyrinths of North Africa. Years passed, then in 1520 a breakthrough. The mission of Rodrigo de Lima. In that year, Portugal sent Rodrigo de Lima, a nobleman, not a priest, with a fleet led by Diogo Lopes de Sequeira to the Red Sea. His goal, to reach the court of Emperor Lebna Dengel, also known as Dawit II, then the reigning Ethiopian monarch. After a grueling overland journey, de Lima and his small party arrived in the highlands, the first sustained European diplomatic mission to Ethiopia. They brought gifts of arms and armor, books and letters from King Manuel I, a young priest and linguist named Francisco Alves, who would record everything in vivid detail. The Ethiopians were cautious but intrigued. A court of faith and suspicion. Lebna Dengel ruled over a vast but fragile kingdom. Muslim states on the Eastern Front, especially the Sultanate of Adal, threatened constant invasion. The Ottoman Empire, expanding through the Red Sea, provided guns and support to these enemies. The Christian highlands were well defended but outdated in weaponry, still relying heavily on spears, swords, and cavalry. When Rodrigo de Lima's mission arrived, Ethiopia saw a potential ally, but it also saw foreign priests, Catholic doctrine, and an empire with its own agendas. Negotiations were cordial but tense. The Portuguese offered help but expected influence. The Ethiopians wanted support but not interference. The stage was set for a fragile alliance, one that would soon be tested in war. The ticking clock of empire. Back in Europe, Portugal's empire was expanding rapidly. Fortresses and trade posts dotted the Indian coast. Spices and silver flowed back to Lisbon. Missionaries pushed deeper into Asia and Africa. But Portugal's power rested on the sea. Ethiopia was inland, mountainous, and inaccessible. Its language, script, and customs were unlike anything Portuguese officials had seen before. Despite the promise of a Christian brotherhood, most Portuguese found Ethiopia alien, not heretical, exactly, but troublingly independent. Rodrigo de Lima's mission remained for several years, but little progress was made. Eventually, he returned to Goa. Only Francisco Alves, the priest, stayed behind, his curiosity and devotion keeping him in the highlands. His writings would become the most detailed European account of Ethiopia for over a century. And still a war approached. Even as diplomacy faltered, conflict grew closer. In the east, a new leader had risen in the Sultanate of Adal, Imam Ahmed ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi, known to history as Ahmed Gran, Ahmed the Left-Handed. He was charismatic, ruthless, and determined to destroy Christian Ethiopia once and for all. And with him came Ottoman-supplied firearms, the very weapons Ethiopia lacked. In the coming years, war would erupt, and Portugal, driven by religion and rivalry, would return not with diplomats but with soldiers. But for now, only questions. Could a Christian alliance across continents survive the weight of its expectations? Would Portugal support Ethiopia or dominate it? And what price would Ethiopia pay for friendship with an empire it barely knew? Can two faiths, so similar in spirit yet so different in history, truly fight side by side. Ethiopia was on fire. By 1529, the long-standing tension between the highland Christian kingdom and the Muslim Sultanate of Adal exploded into open warfare. The storm had a name: Imam Ahmed ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi, better known as Ahmed Gran, Ahmed the Left-Handed. Armed with Ottoman firearms, backed by religious fervor and military brilliance, Ahmed Gran launched a devastating jihad against Christian Ethiopia. His armies burned churches, razed towns, and sent centuries-old monasteries to ruin. Faced with destruction, Emperor Lebna sent a desperate plea across the seas to Portugal. And this time, Portugal answered. What followed was a rare, haunting moment in colonial history, a crusade in Africa by request. The Portuguese returned not as traders or diplomats, but as soldiers and saviors. The rise of Ahmed Gran. Ahmed Gran was not a mere warlord. He was a strategic genius, a deeply religious reformer, and a leader who united fractious Muslim forces in the Horn of Africa under a single banner. With Ottoman matchlocks, arquebuses, and artillery, he redefined warfare in the region. His forces, once outmatched by Ethiopia's cavalry and terrain advantage, now held the upper hand with firepower and speed. By 1531, he had destroyed major Christian strongholds and desecrated dozens of churches. Gran aimed not only to conquer Ethiopia, but to erase it, to replace its faith, rulers, and identity entirely. This was not a border war, it was an existential one. A kingdom in collapse. The impact on Ethiopia was catastrophic. Emperor Lebna, despite brave resistance, was driven into retreat, his armies in shambles. His nobles, many divided by internal rivalries, either surrendered or fled. Sacred relics kept safe for centuries were looted or destroyed. Monasteries hidden deep in the mountains were uncovered and torched. Entire provinces fell. The royal court became a wandering camp, clinging to the last remnants of power. Children were conscripted, farmers became soldiers, and priests carried crosses and swords into battle. Lebna sent envoys once more to the Portuguese outposts in Goa and Massawa, pleading for aid. This time, the urgency was undeniable. Portugal responds, the mission of Cristóvão da Gama. In 1541, Portugal sent a military expedition to Ethiopia, led by Cristóvão da Gama, the son of the legendary explorer Vasco da Gama. He brought roughly 400–500 Portuguese soldiers, seasoned in colonial warfare, several tons of matchlocks, cannons, and armor, a handful of Jesuit priests to ensure the spiritual alignment of their Ethiopian allies. They landed on the Red Sea coast and began their ascent into the highlands, escorted by Ethiopian guides and surviving royal troops. To the Ethiopians, they were messengers of hope. To Ahmed Gran, they were a foreign infestation and a threat he was determined to destroy. A tense alliance. Cristóvão da Gama met Emperor Gelidus, successor to Lebna, who died in 1540, in early 1542. Their alliance was based on desperation, but riddled with tension. The Portuguese insisted on Catholic rites, unsettling the Orthodox Ethiopians, who had their own centuries-old church traditions. The Ethiopians, proud and sovereign, bristled at being treated as spiritual subordinates. Gama's men viewed the Ethiopians as brave but undisciplined and backward, while the Ethiopians viewed the Portuguese as arrogant and alien. Still, they had a common enemy. They prepared for war. The battles of Jart and Wafla. The joint armies first clashed with Ahmed Gran's forces at the Battle of Jart, where the Portuguese firearms shocked the Muslim army, unused to fighting troops trained in disciplined volley fire. The victory was decisive but temporary. Soon after, at Wafla, Cristóvão da Gama's forces were surrounded. After days of battle and betrayal by local informants, Gama was captured. He was tortured and executed by Ahmed Gran, reportedly refusing to convert to Islam to the end. His death became a rallying cry for both Ethiopian and Portuguese forces. But despite the loss of their commander, the alliance held. Emperor Gelidus, galvanized by the foreign aid and his people's suffering, prepared for one final strike. And still the cross stands. In a remote mountain pass, as monks prayed over broken swords and villagers wept in burned churches, the question hung heavy. Could an empire built on faith survive a war waged with fire and iron? The tide of war was about to turn, but victory, if it came, would come at a cost few could imagine. The highlands burned, but the cross remained. After more than a decade of near annihilation at the hands of Imam Ahmed Gran, Christian Ethiopia stood on the brink. But in the ashes of defeat, a strange alliance forged in desperation between Ethiopian warriors and Portuguese soldiers would reclaim not only land, but legacy. We follow the dramatic climax of the Ethiopian-Adal War, the downfall of Ahmed Gran, and the uneasy aftermath of a friendship built on faith and blood. It is a story of military redemption, cultural mistrust, and the long shadow left by foreign boots in a sacred land. The final campaign, 1543. After the martyrdom of Cristóvão da Gama, the remaining Portuguese troops regrouped under new leadership, rallying around the still-determined Ethiopian Emperor Gelidus. By early 1543, Gelidus had managed to assemble a coalition of surviving Ethiopian nobility, who had once fled but now returned to defend their homeland. Highland militias, including peasants turned resistance fighters. Portuguese arquebusiers, fewer than 300 men, yet possessing firepower that still terrified Adal forces. The alliance moved strategically, choosing familiar terrain, forcing the enemy into narrow valleys and steep passes. Their target, Imam Ahmed Gran himself, whose forces were now dispersed across the country. The battle that followed would decide the fate of Ethiopia. The Battle of Wainadaga. The two armies met near Lake Tana, at a place called Wainadaga, in February 1543. Ahmed Gran had begun to lose control of his coalition. Many of his Ottoman advisors had left. His troops were stretched thin across multiple fronts. His reputation, once mythical, was faltering. In the final confrontation, the Portuguese formed tight musket lines, firing in rotating volleys. Ethiopian cavalry flanked the Adalite troops from the hills. Ahmed Gran attempted to rally his men personally, but was struck down by a Portuguese bullet, reportedly while leading a charge. With their leader dead, Adal's army collapsed. For Ethiopia, it was a resurrection. Aftermath, faith reclaimed, but at a cost. The victory at Wainadaga ended the existential threat to Christian Ethiopia, but it did not bring peace. Gelidus expelled the remaining Adal forces, rebuilt churches, and re-established imperial authority. Many villages and monasteries were gone forever, their lineages of clergy and culture broken. The Portuguese, now without a formal mission, were integrated into Ethiopian society. Some became settlers, others returned to Goa or Lisbon. But a new tension arose, not military but religious. The Jesuits stayed behind. Among the survivors was Father Joel Bermudes, a priest who claimed to be Patriarch of Ethiopia, though the Ethiopians never officially accepted him. He and other missionaries began pushing aggressively for Catholic reforms. Replacement of Ethiopian Orthodox practices with Latin rites. Rewriting of theological texts. Submission to the Pope rather than the Patriarch of Alexandria. This led to growing resentment. The Ethiopian Church, though grateful for the aid, had no intention of surrendering its independence. Over the following decades, Jesuit efforts intensified, particularly under the later reign of Susanio's I, who briefly converted to Catholicism in the early 1600s. This led to civil unrest, revolts, and mass rejection of foreign religious influence. Eventually, Catholicism was banned, and the Jesuits were expelled by the mid-1600s. Portugal's military aid had saved Ethiopia, but its religious overreach nearly destroyed it again. Long-term legacy. The Ethiopian-Portuguese alliance remains one of the most unique episodes in early modern history. Its legacy includes the introduction of gunpowder warfare in East Africa, a rare instance where a European army was invited into an African kingdom and left without colonizing it. Centuries of suspicion toward European missionaries in Ethiopian politics. A historical memory of partnership, both painful and proud. Ethiopia survived the 16th century not by becoming a colony, but by fighting alongside a foreign ally and then asserting its own sovereignty. The quiet lesson of the highlands. The ruins of the battlefields remain, scattered across misty mountains and valleys. In old monastic texts and oral traditions, the story of the Franks who came with thundersticks is still told. And one question lingers. Can faith survive when it must be defended by foreign hands? And when the fire dies, who gets to tell the story, the sword or the scripture?